lost power and it came back. So if I disappear, that is why. I do not know what is going on today. But thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm so sorry that I could not be there in person today, and look forward to hearing from my two panelists. I'm going to talk a little bit about a study that I'm doing on elective egg freezing with Ikemoto, and I'm going to talk about a paper that I've just written based on some of the findings from this study. So just as an introduction, elective egg freezing, also called social egg freezing or planned oocyte cryopreservation, also called non-medical egg freezing, refers to egg freezing that's used for the purposes of trying to postpone parenthood. Prior to 2012, this was considered experimental, but once that label was lifted, there has been an increase in Canada and in countries worldwide among the number of people who are using this technology. It is a multi-stage intervention, so the would-be patient is determined to be a good candidate for egg freezing. The patient then takes hormonal birth control to regulate their menstrual cycle. At the beginning of this cycle, they begin hormonal injections to suppress ovulation and stimulate their ovaries. Hormonal injections then continue, and then a pre-retrieval trigger injection is used. The next day, usually the eggs are retrieved transvaginally and then are frozen. And the idea is that it allows people with ovaries to free their eggs to be able to store them and use them in the future. So this research question that I'll talk about today focuses very much on consent, but is part of this bigger project where we're looking at four main things. So the first thing that we've been looking at are what are the underlying reasons or motivations for why people engage in elective egg freezing. The second thing are what are elective egg freezers' experiences with the procedures at Canadian fertility centers? So what are their experiences of care? The third, which very much will be the focus of what I chat about today, looks at the consent processes for people who are going through this procedure at Canadian fertility centers. And then the fourth one kind of flows from those other findings and looks at what are areas for law and policy reform when it comes to regulating egg freezing in Canada. So in this project, we've been collecting three types of data. So the first thing that we've been doing is we've been collecting consent documents from Canadian fertility clinics. And we kind of use consent documents to describe not only the consent form itself, but in many cases, there were accompanying documents that came along with that form. Sometimes they were other forms, sometimes they were links to databases online, sometimes they were slides that a patient had to go through, sometimes they were videos that a patient had to watch before they could sign a consent form. So when we say consent documents, we're talking about the variety of different documents that each of these clinics provides in order for someone to go through a consent process. So we collected those documents from 11 different Canadian fertility clinics. The second thing that we did is we did semi-structured interviews with fertility professionals. So when we reached out to all of the clinics across the country, we asked if they could share their consent documents, and we simultaneously asked if they would be willing to meet with us to talk us through and give us a little bit more surrounding circumstance for how they go through those consent processes. Two fertility professionals met with us and walked us through some of the specifics of how exactly that looks. And then the third component of this project has involved semi-structured interviews with individuals who have electively frozen their eggs. So at this point, we have done interviews with 27 people in Canada who have gone through elective egg freezing at least one cycle with a Canadian fertility clinic. So when we started thinking about this project, and particularly this component that focuses on consent, we really zoned in on thinking about what are some of the concerns that relate to elective egg freezing that might need to be taken into account in these consent processes. So we started by looking at some of these broader questions. So for instance, the literature in this area has identified that elective egg freezing is an individualized medical solution to a social problem. Elective egg freezing takes place in a for-profit industry. It takes place in the private sphere rather than the public sphere. And generally, this kind of industry has little regulation in Canada. We then kind of zoned in, so we collected a ton of literature and spent a long time going through to kind of pull out all of the different concerns that people had raised with regards to elective egg freezing, and specifically the concerns that people had raised that could be taken account into thinking about consent processes. So the first thing that came up were safety concerns. So for instance, the physical and emotional risks that accompany going through the process. So for instance, the fact that we don't have a huge amount of longitudinal data, um, and the fact that this can be quite an emotional experience for a lot of people. We looked at the costs for elective egg freezing across different clinics across the country, and the fact that it is a costly procedure. And in addition to the costs associated with the procedure, you then have to pay to store the eggs. And then there's costs associated with using those eggs down the road. We also looked a lot at the promotion and marketing of this area. There's been a lot of conversation around this. So this idea of elective egg freezing being advertised as a have-it-all technology, or as a form of insurance, or as a situation where, young people who might not otherwise come into the purview of the fertility industry do come into the purview of the industry. The last one that we looked at are questions about what to do with success rates. So how success rates are being set up on different websites, what those look like, how those are framed, whether they're framed in terms of the number of eggs that you might retrieve, the number of births, the number of pregnancies, and what exactly is the meaning behind all of those. And then the last one are questions about what to do with unused eggs. So given the findings that a lot of people have not gone back and actually used these eggs, questions about how do people make decisions about what to do with those unused eggs down the road. So the first thing that we did is Professor Elena Katapin and I wrote a paper that's forthcoming in the Journal of Medical Humanities. And we put together a 7-piece framework where we outlined what we perceive to be an ethical framework for providing the minimum standard of disclosure when it comes to consent processes for elective egg freezing. So the first component of that involves providing information about the nature of the procedure. And so here we're talking about in-depth information that walks through all components of the process, but also talks through what you would do in the future if you came back to use those eggs. The second component of that framework that we put together talks about risks and inconvenience. So when we talk about risks, we're talking about like the physical risks. So for instance, bloating, swelling, infection, bleeding, OHSS, but we're also talking about the psychological risks. So for instance, Kylie Baldwin has documented this period of mourning that people go through of not having been able to experience parenthood in their envisaged way. But we're also talking about inconveniences. So the large number of appointments, waiting times, the need to inject hormones each day, restrictions on exercise, that kind of thing. The third one had to do with financial obligations and concerns. So ensuring that information was provided about the cost of treatment, medication, storage, but also the cost of using eggs in the future. The fourth one had to do with success rates and the possibility of an unsuccessful cycle. So in this particular instance, we wanted success and what success actually meant in that situation to be explained. We want there to be information that there is not a huge amount of data on what success rates are, and we wanted clarity about the fact that there are no guarantees. The fifth one has to do with age and fertility decline. So here we wanted information about the suggestion of there being a low probability of success when freezing at a later age, and for it to be outlined that there is this relationship between age and fertility. The sixth one had to do with just future uses of genetic material. So an understanding of the complex decisions around what you might do with those eggs down the line, and in such a way that it actually accords with federal legislation, so the Assisted Human Reproduction Act, so that people can have thought through what they might want to do if they don't come back to use their eggs down the line, and what actual options are available to them. And then the last one is just a general right to withdraw and an understanding that you can withdraw at all stages of the process. So in this particular paper, what I did is I connected that ethical framework to the law, regulation, and guidelines that exist in Canada in this area, as well as a number of court decisions. And I basically in the paper argue that for all of the ethical reasons that we set out in the JOMH paper, there are also very clear reasons supported by law, regulation, and guidelines in Canada for why this framework would be in accordance with that existing framework and why it would support the way forward with regards to consent with elective egg freezing. So I'm just going to walk you through a little bit some of our findings. So as I mentioned, we looked at consent documents from 11 different clinics. And basically what I did is I looked at them across all of those criteria that we outlined in that ethical framework. And so if it had a black X, it means that it fulfilled that criteria. If it had a blue X, it meant that the topic was mentioned, but there wasn't very much information provided. And if there was a green X, it meant that the information was provided, but in a separate document. And if there's no X whatsoever, it means the information wasn't provided at all. So just a couple of trends that we found in the context of looking at this. So the first one, so with nature of the procedure, some of the consent forms did a really good job of this. They had illustrations and they really walked people through all of the different components, including what you might do with your eggs down the line. But the majority of consent forms didn't deal with the creation and transfer of embryos. Some of them kind of implied that what you were doing was creating embryos, but didn't actually go into what that would entail. And some of them, for instance, provided little information about things like the retrieval process. So for instance, said there would be a retrieval process, but didn't explain what that was or what the purpose of that was. With regards to the risks, ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome came up in most of the consent forms, but interestingly, the risk of it was defined very differently across the different documents. So whereas some clinics described it as a less than 10% risk, some described it as a less than 2% risks, and another one described it as a less than 5% risks. And generally, we found that none of the consent forms talked about psychological or emotional risks, and none of them talked about inconveniences. With regards to the financial obligations, none of that was included in the consent form itself. It was always included in additional documentation. In most cases, they didn't talk about storage costs or there was a link that said refer to our website to find out costs about storage. And in almost no situations did they provide any kind of understanding of what it would cost to use those eggs down the road. And we also noted that none of the consent documents talked about things like funding that could be available. The third one had to do with success rates. So here we saw a lot of variation in terms of how exactly success was defined. And so again, we noticed that in some situations, success was being defined as live birth rates. Some situations it was pregnancy. Some situations it was a number of eggs. In some situations, there was a suggestion that 10 eggs was the ideal number of eggs. And if you got that number of eggs, it was success. So there was a lot of variation here. And there was also a lot of lack of clarity about whether those success rates that were cited were clinic specific. Age and fertility decline was not something that we found in many of the consent documents. With future uses of genetic material, this was another area where we saw a lot of variation. So for instance, some consent forms outlined a couple of options and you could put an X beside the option that you wanted. Some consent forms just said, outline in your will what you would like to happen to your eggs. Some consent forms said the clinic will check back with you every single year, and at that point you can let them know what you'd like to do. So there was quite a bit of variation in that particular instance. And then the last one was just right to withdraw. And surprisingly, we found that even though almost all the consent forms mentioned right to withdraw in some regard, most of them didn't mention it in a clear way that made it evident that you could withdraw at any point in the process. So I'm just going to wrap it up there. But generally, what our findings are illustrating is that informed consent for elective egg freezing seems to rely on an unstandardized patchwork of information sources. So, as I mentioned, sometimes it's a consent form, but accompanied by different material, and there's a lot of variation when it comes to clinic. Generally, the clinic materials are not adhering to these minimum elements of disclosure for consent for elective egg freezing. So they're maybe adhering to some, but not adhering to all of them. As I mentioned, we also in the paper make the argument that this is supported by existing law, regulations, and guidelines. And then one of the things that we talk about are areas where it might be worth having future regulation of consent processes in order to be able to think about how to improve this process such that it adheres to this ethical framework.
Thank you very much, Katie. We're now going to turn on to our second speaker, Elgin.
That's all right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the center. And I would also like to do a shout out to my supervisor, Professor Christabel Sethna, who is here, and my one of my committee members is here as well. So thanks for folks for coming to support. So while my work itself is on egg freezing and desires for biogenic parenthood among trans and gender diverse people, I decided I was going to take a step back and kind of talk about what could go wrong with egg freezing. What are some of the legal implications that it comes in legal critiques of egg freezing as a feminist technology? So this one. Oh, there we go. So the first thing we always need to remember is business is booming. In 2022, Canada says it's at its lowest fertility rate ever. Women are having an average of 1.33 children. And in Canada also, there is close to 1/4 of individuals aged 15 to 49 who, during the pandemic, for some reason, decided they really wanted to change their ideas of what reproduction should look like for them. And so in the face of things like COVID-19, we definitely rearrange our desires for parenthood and what we want them to look like. And even currently, 1 in 6 couples are experiencing infertility. What's even more interesting is that in Canada in 2013, there were 94 egg freezing treatments, but by 2022, there's over 1,500. So what we're seeing is this massive boom in popularity in egg freezing. Now, there are 2 different types of egg freezing, as Katie kind of outlined. She was talking a lot about elective egg freezing or social egg freezing. I'm talking about both types, the medical form of egg freezing and the elective form of egg freezing. But the important thing to remember is that it's really elective egg freezing that has a lot of these considerations because there is no medical reason for freezing. So, and it's really interesting too, because there's always been a discussion of needing a clinical routine when we're talking about especially elective egg freezing. What are we supposed to do? What are the guidelines? And what is the regulation? So currently in 2024, one of the things I found is there's well over 60 fertility clinics in Canada. So fertility clinics have also just boomed across the country, which means that they're obviously making money. So what could go wrong? This is my thought cloud of some of the preliminary things just off the top of my head in about 10 minutes I could come up with that could go possibly legally wrong with egg freezing. I'm going to go into a couple of them, and I'm happy to come back to this image as well. But the big one that I want to talk about, and Katie kind of talked about as well, is advertising. Advertising for egg freezing. So when it comes to legal critiques of egg freezing, there are many. However, the overlap between ethics and law are very important to discuss when we're talking about egg freezing. And advertising is among one of the really, really big and important ones. So at this time, I personally think advertising for freezing for mostly elective egg freezing is really commonplace. You'll see it everywhere. You'll see it on university campuses. You'll see it, some people see it when they're on billboards. When I was starting my work, I kept doing, Google searches of, information about egg freezing. And then all of a sudden, this very sweet white gay couple kept showing up on my Facebook feed asking me for my eggs. There was 2 sets. I called one set Mike and Mark and the other Stefan and Steve, I think, or Stefan and Steve. But it was it's just like donate your eggs, be a part of the better cause, or freeze your eggs even. So it's just like, so be either donate your eggs and help another couple, or be proactive, freeze your eggs now because you're young and your eggs are great and viable. So this advertising for egg freezing can be found internationally on social media platforms, in doctors' offices, and as I mentioned, in university campuses and colleges. However, despite the increase in advertising for egg freezing as a liberating, game-changing feminist technology, catchphrases like egg insurance, freeze your freezing time, rewinding the biological clock, and cutting edge have been used to describe the process of egg freezing. And it's really been a really big critique of, is this actually feminist technology? Is it actually pro-women? Because it's advertising that folks are able to have it all. So you're able to have, you know, your career, your education, and you can also put your fertility on hold so you can find Mr. Right. So you can see a couple of the different advertisements there. Take control of your fertility. And it's always beautiful, sweet looking white babies next to pictures of ice cubes. You know, time is running out. So now's the time to freeze your eggs. So it's really interesting that egg freezing is promoted as a feminist technology and as a technology that's made for women to help with this. However, what's interesting too is how there hasn't been a lot of discussion about how advertising actually should happen. Should fertility clinics legally be able to advertise for egg freezing? Well, in Canada, there are acts such as the Competition Act that seek to reduce things like false and misleading advertising. It's also true that advertising is not the only overarching part of the problem when it comes to egg freezing. One of the biggest critiques of egg freezing as well is the bias, the intrinsic bias. Once again, happy, smiling babies, women laying back being like, oh, it's taken care of. These are all misleading. So is it actually legal and ethical to create these types of advertising that situates egg freezing in a particular way? So the legal concerns when it comes to advertising egg freezing is also, where can there be advertisements? That's my thought. I'm like, oh, where should I be able to see egg freezing advertisements? Can companies actively advertise egg freezing to employees? I think Lisa's going to have some really interesting thoughts about this as well. And can universities allow egg freezing advertisements on campus? At what point should there be an extent of advertising for egg freezing? Because of course, once again, as Katie kind of said too, how does the informed consent process work? So all we're seeing is the happy smiling babies and, you know, the relaxed women sitting in their, you know, their Adirondack chairs, but we're not seeing the things that actually come after that. Oh, there we go. Another one that I've really been thinking about lately is storage. Storage of eggs is a really interesting one for me. So currently in Canada, there's no time on how long you can freeze your eggs. So while this is super convenient for some, so for instance, for folks that are freezing for medical reasons, it's very, very helpful. However, there are some really interesting legal implications. With the increasing number of people who choose to freeze their eggs, especially at younger ages, are we going to say, you know, enough's enough, you can't keep your eggs frozen for 30 years, or how long is too long? Another one is storage fees. I find storage fees such an interesting one because my thought process is if we have no regulation regarding how long people can have them in storage, are we going to start doing like an inflation tax on storage fees? Is that even legal? At what point can fertility clinics say, well, you know, you froze your eggs about 5 years ago and it's really expensive to store eggs now, so we're going to up your storage fee. So what are the parameters surrounding that? What are these contracts saying? And another one is what is done with unused eggs. So what happens if an individual, first I want to start with what happens if you can't pay. So what happens if, you know, you've had your eggs frozen for a certain number of years, but now you can't pay your storage fee? One of the portions is one of the possible options is that fertility clinics can make the executive decision to destroy your frozen eggs. They can say, you know, you're not paying your storage fees, we can get rid of them. And that's a really interesting question. Also the question of abandoned eggs. So people who leave their eggs at fertility clinics, who has the legal right to destroy those eggs? At what point are we talking about, property? And I know Alana has done quite a bit of work on this idea of abandoned embryos. So these are all the legal considerations and things that kind of float around in my mind when it comes to egg freezing as well. So there's also been legal documentation that's had to be created in order to discuss the very interesting and common implications that egg freezing has. So I wasn't surprised to find that egg freezing is discussed in many law documents, things like prenup agreements. So somebody freezes their eggs before marriage. Is it going to be this person says, I'm going to use my eggs, or in the event of divorce, what do people do with eggs? I know it's a lot more tricky with embryos, but one similar with eggs as well. People talk about what happens in the event of a person's death. So wills are a big one, especially for people who are freezing for medical reasons and could potentially be thinking about what happens in the worst case that I don't survive treatment. So these are all really interesting and very real questions that we need to be asking. Can you legally require someone to withdraw their eggs as well? What does that look like? Can you say, can you, in the event of I know it's very unlikely because once again, business is booming, but if a fertility clinic closes, what's the legality there? Do they have to find a new place for your eggs? Is there price matching that will come into play? These types of things are just all very interesting. And I know especially during COVID-19, legal access was a very, very big question. So people were really needing to talk about their eggs. And a last one that's really interesting too, that's become really, really important in conversations is damage to egg freezing equipment. So faulty equipment has caused legal issues for fertility clinics. And when you use the term egg insurance, of course it is, because people are thinking this is a sure thing. So that also goes back into advertising as well. If we're advertising it's a sure thing, when things like the freezers or the liquid nitrogen that's used to freeze eggs is faulty, what happens then? So this happened in the UK at a London fertility clinic, and two clients were actually impacted. Their frozen eggs were impacted by defective freezing liquid, and their eggs could be damaged. Another is in Ohio in 2018. There was the loss of almost 4,000 eggs and embryos because of a malfunction of a freezer. 4,000 eggs. Who's responsible for that? What happens if you can't replace those eggs? There's so much that gets wrapped up into these experiences. Okay, and real quickly, I'm just going to talk about the withdrawal and talk about unused eggs. So I found a lot of folks have talked about unused reproductive tissue. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is at the very bottom is this split program. Has anyone heard about split programs? So a split program is, and I think it's become more of a thing in the States, but what you can do is you can come into the egg freezing process with the intention that you will donate half your eggs. So they say, we will actually cover the cost of egg freezing for you if you donate half your eggs. This is what's interesting is once again, who financially benefits from these situations. And what happens if, for instance, you get a lower yield of eggs. So let's say you freeze your eggs and you only end up with 8. So you've already said, I'll give 4 away for donation and I'll keep 4 for myself. So what are the likeliness? How does informed consent come into this split program as well? So these are the types of things that just, swim around in my brain on a Friday afternoon, thinking about, thinking about egg freezing and, life, the universe and everything. So I'm happy to have further conversations with folks about this as well, but egg freezing, especially with the way of the popularity that it has and the momentum it has and the number of egg freezers that there are out there, I think it's just so important that we think about what the implications, both biomedical and also bioethical and legal, when we're talking about egg freezing. What are the rights of egg freezers? If you were to be that person that has that malfunction, what are your legal rights? So all these things combined, oh, I did the back one. So kind of in conclusion, as egg freezing continues to thrive in popularity, I want to reiterate the thoughts of the importance of considering what are the legal considerations of egg freezing. Egg freezing goes beyond the process itself. We have learned about the importance of informed consent. Katie talked about conformed consent quite a bit, and that's a big part of it as well. When we think egg insurance, when we think we're going to have it all, is that the end? Is that what actually ends up happening? There's so much emotions that come into egg freezing, especially for people who are freezing for medical reasons. So what is it that's actually happening? And how do we make sure that we are cognizant of informed consent, especially when it comes to things like advertising, success rates in storage, and what happens to unused eggs? So egg freezing has far more critiques in my mind than I was able to talk about. But that is just some of the things that have been, like I said, floating around my brain for the last little while when it comes to egg freezing and as a modern technology. Thanks.
All right, is it working?
Yes.
All right, it's just me between you and the weekend. Thanks for staying. Oh, yeah, we can put that on. Hang on a sec. Okay, oops, there's the beginning of my talk here. So I was thinking that my talk wasn't going to relate at all to the rest of the panel or the rest of the conference. But actually, thanks to Elgin, I think we have a nice flow going here. So, all right, let me start my timer. Good. All right, so I'm focusing on the US, and when I thought of this topic and started putting together my thoughts about this presentation, it was slightly dystopian. In the past 2 weeks, it's become deeply dystopian, although I'm gonna try to end on a slightly lighter note. So I'm focusing here on what could be disturbing aspects of reproductive and genetic technology use. And I'm going to start by just noting, I'm not going to focus on this for the rest of the talk, but I'm going to note that many of these practices lead to amazing outcomes. People become parents, they form family. In the US, and I think also in Canada, the families have sort of created this liberatory space. They have proved, not to everybody in the US, but to many, and for purposes of getting marriage equality law through in the US, prove that the stories pathologizing single parent families, LGBTQ families, multiple parent families are not stories of pathology, but stories of success and thriving. Now, having said that, I'm going to turn to the dystopian aspects. All right. So what I'm going to look at is the overlaps and tensions between kind of discourses coming up in national politics and especially recent electoral politics, and ways that, on the other hand, that reproductive and genetic technologies are offered in the US and used with respect to genomics, nation, and race. So, is it the green button? There's my starting point. And so, of course, just to start with a little bit about sort of political discourse in the US, of course, because of the topic of this particular conference, we have to think about the role of the abortion discourse. It's not just Dobbs, but everything that preceded it, and certainly everything that's happened since it. But the country is now defined, and you've probably seen the maps of the US marked in zones, basically geographic zones with different colors representing different levels of abortion restrictions or reproductive freedom protections in those particular states. And so those divisions are also having an interesting effect, as previous speakers have noted, on assisted reproductive technology use. What's interesting is that abortion has split the Republicans on their position with respect to complete abortion bans versus other levels of restrictions. And it's certainly, become sort of troubling for Republican unity when the Alabama Supreme Court earlier this year decided to recognize a wrongful death claim or wrongful death claims for the negligent destruction of multiple in vitro embryos in a clinic in Alabama. Again, Republicans have split on that particular issue. some of them want to support some protection for in vitro fertilization, but they don't want to do it, but it helps LGBTQ people gain access and create families. And then during the past 8 years, and certainly very recently, Trump has been using explicitly eugenic ideas in his campaign speeches. His statements echo white nationalist rhetoric, which harks back directly to the early 20th century state-sponsored eugenic programs that we had in the United States and to some extent in Canada as well. He's been using phrases talking about good genes and the racehorse theory. His, I don't think I have a slide for that. I have too many buttons. I'm pushing the wrong ones, right? And now, he's also in his sort of call for shutting down all the borders and evicting a good percentage of our population because they're immigrants, has been referencing bad genes and those who've been poisoning the blood of our country. And again, harking back to earlier periods in the 20th century when immigration laws were used in a racialized way to keep people out, the wrong people out, the bad genes out of the country. So now turning to reproductive technologies. Reproductive technologies, of course, use narratives about family that tap into concepts of genetic race and nation as well. And I hope to sort of elicit that in my remarks. So very quick history. My guess is that many of you have more expertise about this than I do, but in the US, of course, it's an industry. It's a highly commercialized industry, and I'm going to use the term fertility industry throughout my talk. Deborah Spar's book, The Baby Business, shows how rapidly fertility became big business from the launch of the first commercial sperm bank in the United States in the 1970s to the early IVF clinics in Virginia, California, and New York, to surrogacy centers following shortly after in the 1980s, and egg agencies, accompanied by the formation of all these non-medical service entities as well. So one point I would make is that commercialization combined with the use of contract has produced a logic that stratifies reproduction in this setting, not in every instance, but often. So for example, contract is used to arrange parties as either direct beneficiaries of, for example, surrogacy arrangements, egg donation and sperm donation, and then situate those who provide those services as third parties. And that's the way the contracts work. If you want to use any of these technologies to create, for example, a multi-parent family, you have to work outside of that sphere. You have to avoid the clinics and the fertility centers and the lawyers in particular. So, and commercialization staggers payment to draw college and graduate students into gamete provision. It's not a coincidence that one of the major sperm banks is strategically located between MIT and Harvard. For example, on the East Coast, there's one down near Stanford, and their third branch is near Berkeley. So, and then working class moms largely, not exclusively, but largely are drawn into surrogacy. So the stated purposes have shifted over time. When these services were launched from really the early 80s, the sort of story was told was about this is fertility therapy, primarily for married couples with a medical diagnosis of infertility. And of course, marriage at that time was heteronormative. So it's the sort of cisgender man and cisgender women that was sort of the icons of this type of fertility use. By the 1990s, many clinics and agencies expanded business by offering services to people who hope to become either single parents or parents as lesbian and gay couples. And the sort of new framing was family formation. So that's been added on to ART use as fertility therapy. The industry has really doubled down on creating family, and I'm using the term creating because that's a tagline on many of this on the center websites. And then I haven't done it systematically, but when I was preparing my slides, family building, building shows up. It's starting to show up more often than creating family. And I'm not completely sure why. I just have hypotheses. So increasingly, and this is part of my main theme, what the industry is doing now is expanding their patient base and their businesses and their profits by appealing especially to gay couples, and by reaching out of the country more and more, so global outreach. And I live in California, which is a major destination spot for fertility tourism, and on offering the newest high-tech services. So increasingly, the high-tech services that are being offered are in the form of genetic selection technology. Here we go. So this is from California Cryobank's website. California Cryobank is usually ranked as the second biggest sperm bank in the global market. Cryos is usually number one. The United States is the biggest importer or exporter of sperm in the global markets, and it's largely through California Cryobank. So they have all these drop-down menus when you're going through a donor search. And one of the primary sort of functions that you can choose is sort of self-identified race and background, certainly height, weight. California Cryobank has a height minimum of 5.7, which offends half my students. And you can choose hair color, eye color, all of those things, so phenotypical kinds of things. But they also create these bios for the donors. These are the ones that you can get for free by just surfing through the website. If you pay a fee, of course, you get access to more detailed information. So this just gives you a sense. My student's favorite this year was Aquaman. This is Blue-Eyed Architect. You can also see that you can search by education level, bachelor, master's, or postgraduate. And then they have, this is why I like California Cryobank, they have a celebrity lookalike search function as well. I'm not sure exactly that everybody uses all these services, but they are made available, so clearly they must be working for some. So here's one of the newest things that some of these agencies and centers are starting to offer is they're combining it with genetic ancestry testing, so that for those donors who have gone through ancestry testing, you can get a copy of their report if you pay an extra fee. And so you see the sort of crossover between genetic testing for like the direct-to-consumer type of genetic testing and the fertility industry as well. You also have these niches, race-specific and ethnic-specific niches. So a few years ago, there was one egg donation agency for Asians, and now there are multiple. There are some for South Asians where they're offering choice by caste, for example. And here's, I'm going to shift a little bit to the direct-to-consumer genetic testing. Genetic testing of all types is now proliferating sort of every stage of assisted reproductive technology use, but ancestry testing is now entering as well. So this is from Ancestry.com, and certainly 23andMe is one of the other big players in this sector, although I think it's about to go down because of their recent hacking scandals and the hundreds of millions of dollars they are paying out as we speak, and the mass resignation of their board. Anyways, you can see Ancestry does something interesting. They do not use the word race, but they use images and they use the word ethnicity. And certainly, you know, all the sort of people, social scientists and scientists in the room know that ethnicity is a social construct. It's a cultural construct. It's not a genetic thing at all, but they provide these ethnicity estimates by percentage. And the implication is, I just wrote a book chapter that you can, people read this and they sort of interpret it as race. And the information is provided in a way which sort of supports that interpretation. So the idea is that you can sum up your racial mixture to 100. So you consist of a series of racial purities, if you will. Here's just another page from Ancestry.com for the 7% Scottish ancestry that you might have, a little bit of imagery. I'm going through this fast. And then, not surprisingly, white nationalists have turned to 23andMe and Ancestry.com to prove their white creds. and some of them get upset when they find out they're not pure. Aaron Panofsky, I would suggest that you read his work. He's done some really great work sort of explicating these. He's at UCLA. And then just sort of tipping to the other types of testing, polygenic risk score, risk scoring for purposes of identifying traits like the desire to succeed in competitive. It's not a thing. There's no scientific evidence behind that, but this is a fertility center website that we're looking at. So that's now being added in, and you can see the technology here is now being proposed for use with embryos. Oh, I have 1 minute. All right. So I do want to mention very quickly before I close out that in the United States, venture capital, for example, is the reason that egg freezing rolled out so quickly and so quickly became the largest sector of the fertility industry in the US. And now it's private equity. They've started out buying clinics, and now they're funding these new technologies. So just one data point, in the clinics that are private equity owned, they are selling more add-ons, which often have no efficacy than clinics that are non-private equity owned. For those who are owning these new technology markets, for example, there's even a higher level of hype and promise than normally accompanies those kinds of startups. And now there's sort of private equity entering into the space of CRISPR. In vitro gametogenesis, for example, is funded by some of these types of owners and investors, if you will, which means that with little direct regulation in the United States, either over these particular technologies or the fertility industry itself, and certainly not with respect to private equity, these things may roll out relatively quickly with little to no accountability. And I will just end. I think there's a lot of space still between sort of the national rhetoric that I flagged at the beginning and what's going on in the fertility sector. And I promised you that I would end on a note of hope right now. There's actually been organized efforts in the past few years to sort of build up centers of resistance. So California, for example, is positioning itself as a state of resistance, in particular with respect to family formation and technology. They're not really doing a good job at technology oversight. But the last thing I'll say is that yesterday there was I think a pretty energetic critique of sort of the strategic use of hope in what's going on now. And I want to push back a little. One of my highly respected colleagues says, and I think she's right, is that hope is local right now and for the next years. And I think we need to use that. Thank you.
It's working. So now we will open up to questions. Yes, thank you.
Oh, is it on? You can hear me. Okay. Yeah, thank you for a wonderful panel again. Really, really informative day. Really interesting perspectives. Thank you. My question, yes, is exactly what you just touched on the end of that last talk. This movement of private equity into this realm of fertility. And so I just attended a conference in Vancouver, the Canadian Fertility and Andrology Society conference, where they presented that it's now in Canada, the profile is 70% of fertility clinics are owned by private equity companies, 70%. And they were talking a little bit about what some of the projections were for what happens next, because generally you start with the venture capitalists who invested when fertility was kind of under-researched and poorly talked about, the high-risk zones. Now we've moved into private equity. Next would be like IPOs, like sending fertility clinics into like publicly traded spaces, I guess, in like 3 to 5 years. I just was wondering, like from the American representation, how has this played out? And then what might we anticipate in Canada? And also just like largely your perspective on what we all think the implications for good or for bad. I mean, I imagine we're all assuming for bad of having these finance bros, for lack of a better term, in our reproductive health spaces and what the implications and what we might prepare for.
Yeah, I think, well, two things. One is that usually the goal of venture capital is to go for an IPO, right, to go public. And for private equity, their goal is it's shorter term actually, and that's what's really scary is they hope to sell and make a high profit within 5 years on average. So that means that they're pulling as much profit as they can and trying to pump up the value of the company for sale within a relatively short period. That's why I think it ramps up the hype, right, about sort of the promise of the technologies that they're developing, or they're trying to pull as much profit out of the clinics by really pushing the add-ons with, you know, little or no data about the efficacy of those add-ons. But the other concern that I sort of didn't make the connection on, I was hoping you would infer, was that it's proving, you know, successful right now to hype the role of genetics and the, you know, sort of that sort of valorize the biogenetic connection. And so, and especially I think the connections between sort of racial identity, personal identity, nation, even some sectors. And so there's, you know, I think with those types of investor-backed ownership, they have no reason to back off of that kind of messaging. So my concern is that we're going to see
Okay, perfect. And one of my biggest concerns too, when it comes to fertility clinics being owned by corporations and these different things, is also like the marketability of traits. And like you were talking about, Lisa, too, this idea of like what desirable genetics do people have, but also from my perspective, I think about how the equality movement has been very much used to boost fertility clinics as well. This idea in many ways of rainbow capitalism. And, you know, Jasmine Puar talks about good gays versus bad queers. So are queer people becoming active consumers in the fertility market? Are we using, how can we use, you know, when I made the argument too that, you know, am I being targeted as a queer person to donate my eggs to other queer people? Are they like pulling the heartstring of people that way as well? So what is actually being done, and how is it that one of the things I've been thinking about too is like this idea of trans affirmation, especially when it comes to changing stem cells into reproductive cells. So can I pay a huge amount for my stem cells to become sperm cells to reinforce my feelings of masculinity? Is that going to be pushed onto me? Are reproductive technologies going to be used among trans and gender diverse people to say, this is a way to affirm your gender? This is what, because you can be just like, you know, assigned male at birth people who identify as men. So how is it that, you know, while reproductive technologies like uterine transplants and things like this are so wonderful for communities, what is it also doing it against communities? What is the backfire? It's always fertility clinics want to make a buck. And so how do we do this in an informed and conscientious way of, once again, how is this, there's this market hype, and how is it that fertility clinics are going to be, or a particular type of fertility clinic is going to be pushed for, let's say, 5 years and then pulled back? What's going to happen then? And then you're going to get into, okay, I've got to move my eggs to a different fertility clinic, or I have to switch who I'm using my services for, because if it's a venture capitalist, like Lisa said, it's not meant to be a long-term investment.
I just want to check if Katie is online and just wants to respond to this question at all.
Just briefly, I guess, honestly, this was part of our impetus for wanting to look at the consent processes, is just the concerns that have been raised about the potential conflicts of interest that could come into care. And especially, as Elgin pointed out, given all of the advertising that happens in this area, I think it becomes especially important to make sure that people are given concrete information about what exactly that they're agreeing to, in the light of that potential conflict of interest.
Thanks, Katie.
So I had a question. I wanted to kind of ask about a different technology that wasn't explicitly discussed, but because you all are thinking about sort of technologies and dystopia, I think it will fit. So I was at a legal scholars conference right after Dobbs, and this might be kind of a particularly US question, but there was a health privacy panel where they were talking about sort of online data, people's geographical locations. There was an example that people who got within, a certain number of feet of an abortion clinic would then start getting crisis pregnancy center advertising. So the sort of ways that people are being tracked via their phones. And I was just thinking about the anthropologist Gail Kligman wrote a book about Romania when they banned abortion from 1966 to 1989 and the effects of that on doctors and women. And that was in a pre-digital technological era. And I'm thinking about, as we move forward, you're kind of, all of you are kind of thinking about the ways that people are using technologies and these are being commercialized and how they might be affecting individual identities or individual decisions. But I'm also wondering, are there, are any of you, and do you know of work being done to think about the potential role of technology in surveilling people's reproductive decision-making? I think the thing I didn't say about Gail Kligman's book was one of the things that Ceausescu did was instituted pregnancy tests on the factory floor. So everybody going to work would get pregnancy tested once a month. And if they were found to be pregnant, they would follow along to make sure that they gave birth. And I'm just thinking about, there are searches that we all do. Anya Prince is a legal scholar who's written about, she's a privacy scholar trying to keep her own pregnancy secret and couldn't from Google. So I wonder if anybody's kind of putting these two things together, the sort of health, privacy, digital surveillance, and impending reproductive restrictions, especially in the US. Right.
That framework of digital surveillance.
Mhm.
Sorry. So it's been standard practice for surgeons or surgical patients to be tested for pregnancy before they undergo surgery, and the professional organization just changed their recommendation. So it's fine to ask them, but not write anything down and not run a test that will end up in their medical record, because they're concerned about tracking in the states that, you might be prosecuted. So that doesn't really address yours, but I'll get the name of that book to you.
Yeah, one of the things, so when I when I was getting these Facebook ads for egg donation with Mike and Mark, in 3 weeks, I got 38 on my Facebook feed. And that's just because I'm a graduate student who's talking about egg freezing and egg donation and stuff. So I think there's so much implications when it comes to, and I also really would love to know, it's just like, how does the algorithm work that it knew, okay, this is the couple that will get Elgin to think about egg freezing, or like, how is it that how did they use algorithms to predict which advertising would work best? As someone who's very openly queer on social media. So I'm like, how strategic is it? Another thing too is like thinking about 23andMe and the age of, anonymous donation. It's very, very interesting that technologies and things like, even menstrual hygiene apps, they'll be able to tell, like, it's just like, are you all of a sudden getting ads now for, oh, do you need menstrual hygiene products? It's almost that time of the month. So these types of things are just, it's so interesting. And the biopolitics that go into it, and the surveillance, like how much about our bodies is actually going to be known at any given time. And how is this the start? It's always liberation, is always the way it's framed. And then the next thing you know, we're living the dystopia where we are barcodes. Our bodies have barcodes. Our entire, like, everything in our body can be known at any given time. So yeah, that's a very interesting question.
Any other questions? You want to go up? Yeah.
Hello. So my question is primarily for Dr. Hammond. I love informed consent documents, which is like maybe a bit of a nerd issue, but one of the things I like really strongly believe is a bit of an ethical imperative is to make sure that those documents, because one of the things we know about them is that people don't read them, and it's hard to make people read them no matter how much we want to, is that they are accessible. So I mean, both in terms of their like length format, and their framing and their language. So I'm curious, as you were doing your analysis, to what extent you looked at those types of things, like the length of the documents, the language that was used, like what sort of audience are we catering to, and if that was a part of your recommendations at all.
Yeah, this is such a good question. And now every single time I do my own consent forms, like if I'm at a clinic or something, I'm like so interested in looking at this. So when we looked at the consent forms, myself and two RAs actually went through each one according to those criteria. Then we came back together, looked at the extent to which we agreed. We actually very conveniently had agreed on pretty much everything, and then we kind of did that analysis. But one of the things that came up a lot was, especially for the two of them who haven't worked as much in this area, they felt like there was a lot of things that they didn't understand what the wording was, or they didn't understand what the process was, or there was a lot of assumption of knowledge going on. And so in the forms, we found that the language was not well catered. If you didn't know all of the kind of like specific, I guess, lingo that people use in this area. But actually, one of the things that was kind of interesting is that a lot of the clinics are using this online video platform, where they basically send a link to patients. Patients have to go through the videos. It shows whether they've watched the videos, and then at that point, they're allowed to sign the consent process. Interestingly, and connecting back to the question before about industry, this video platform is like an industry thing that the clinics, I think, have bought into, but is actually remarkably much more accessible than the actual forms. And even though when you click through it, you can go quickly and you don't have to like answer questions for the most part to move on, the information is like quite apparent, such that you do take it in actually, I think, better than you would if you're just given a form and have to go through it. So it's a really, really interesting question, and something that we're thinking about from the project is actually kind of putting together a model consent form, whether that's a consent form or a consent set of documents or other things, that both has all of that information, but also takes into account exactly what you just said, which is like accessibility of that information as well. Because certainly, I think like one of the things that we've grappled a lot in this research is that at the point of having already gone to the clinic and having made the decision to freeze your eggs, how much would a consent form actually, like, would it change your decision? Probably not. So then what is the use of the consent form? It's, I guess, to just give you that information. So trying to consider that piece of the puzzle when thinking about the extent to which it needs to provide certain information.